Welcome on into the Cougar Tracks podcast powered by KSLSports.com. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper, coming to you from Waco, Texas, as the Cougars are 5-0. They take down the Baylor Bears 34-28. The number 22 ranked Cougars are likely to move up in the AP Top 25 poll after this win. So much to unpack from this game that was a lot closer than it expected to be after the strong start from BYU, but the Cougars hold on and get the victory. You can follow me on X at Mitch_Harper, Instagram as well. Follow KSL Sports on all the socials. We've got content too on YouTube. I've been doing post-game recap videos from the field at these games, so go check that out on YouTube as well. But again, the Cougs get it done 34-28, and the start from this BYU team was epic. They were up 21-0, and it looked like nothing was going to slow them down. And the second half then happened, and the offense was completely slowed down, and they were brought to a absolute halt, and they only end up with 3 points in the second half, and they held on. They needed an interception from Crew Wakley in the final minute and a half to secure that victory over the Baylor Bears. The big takeaway to me, and I talked about this yesterday on the podcast, the style points don't matter, just win ball games. And there's going to be a feeling every week probably where people are going to ask, how good is this team? How good are they really? Look, if you're measuring BYU up against Alabama and Georgia, you're probably going to be underwhelmed, maybe even Texas too, number one team in the country. You're going to probably be underwhelmed. Measure them up against the Big 12. Watching these games right now in the Big 12 Conference throughout this season, currently I'm watching Utah take on Arizona, and Utah just got stopped on another fourth down, their second of the night. BYU is in a great position to be in a spot to chase that Big 12 championship game. That's all you can ask for. Again, this conversation about are they good, are they not? Yes, BYU football is a good team. They are a really good team this year. Are they elite where they're going to be a national champion team? I don't know. But guess what? They're good enough to win maybe the Big 12 this year. And by default, that puts you into the playoff. So, yes, they could be a national title contender and maybe be a top 4 seed in the college football playoff. Still a lot of football to go, of course. But you're 2-0 in Big 12 play, and you're 5-0 in overall. And one of those 2 wins was against one of the best teams in the league in Kansas State, who we saw blow the doors off of Oklahoma State earlier today. So that you have a tiebreaker over one of the best teams in the league. BYU has everything in front of them that they can accomplish this year. But this game against Baylor, the offense, the way they started was so refreshing to see BYU in a morning game at McLean Stadium. It was a lackluster crowd. There didn't feel like there was much juice in the stadium entering the game. I kind of felt bad for the BYU fans that went to this game. I'm thinking, man, last week's game in Provo was off the charts electric. And then for those people that go to this game, it's a little bit like, this is kind of underwhelming in terms of atmosphere and excitement because Baylor fans are ready to can Aranda. And honestly, when they got down 21-0, I asked myself, is Aranda going to be around for the second half? Because BYU was destroying this Baylor team. And keep in mind, too, BYU was shorthanded. No L.J. Martin, no Sione Aimoa. He didn't make the trip, banged up. And then Hinckley Ropati, he was dressed, suited up, but didn't play. He went through warm-ups, but ultimately didn't get the call. So it wasn't like BYU had their full collection of talent, yet they still get it done. We'll get to some of the injuries and banged-up personnel a little bit later here. But I love the playmaking ability early on from BYU offensively. Jake Retzlaff to Miles Davis for a 26-yard touchdown. Nice touch on that pass. And then the playmaking ability, once again, from the BYU defense. It was an extension of the Kansas State game where the defense comes up with a big play and BYU's offense takes over in a short field. Blake Mangelson gets the interception. John Nelson with the pass deflection, and Mangelson puts BYU at the Baylor 20-yard line. Next thing you know, Chase Roberts receives a backwards pass. I thought it was forward, but it ended up being backwards, so they called it a rushing touchdown. Jake Retzlaff and Kalani were talking about that in the postgame press conference before they hit the mics, how they were a bit surprised by that. But Chase gets into the end zone, and next thing you know, it's 14-0. And at that point, Baylor has only ran one offensive snap. One. And BYU's already got 2 touchdowns. It was quite the hole that BYU dug Baylor in. And then Isaiah Glasker comes up with a big stop on 4th and 1. Everything was working for BYU in that first quarter, and it just continued to get better. Now Wahine popped off a big 12-yard run after a false start penalty by Sonny Mocassini, who we'll get to in a moment. Devin Bobby had a late hit, and it extended the play. It was it was a little bit extracurricular, too, the push on Retzlaff, and it hit the bench. It feels like a distant memory at this point after that whirlwind game, but it kind of felt like, was that a little bit of a Cam Rising moment where Jake hits hard into an object, this case being a bench, but he got up and was fine, and then the next play, he pops off a 17-yard touchdown run, and BYU was up 21-0. It was an amazing start, and you knew BYU was going to win this game. Now, again, Baylor made it close, and it was up in the air in moments, but what a start. What a statement early by BYU, because, look, it was well documented, the day game struggles. BYU was not playing at their best, and they just come out and they played ball, and it was some of the best football I've seen from a Kalani Sitake team in quite some time. And it was, and that includes even the Kansas State game. Like, this was perfection in many phases, and it just looked like BYU was taking off. Then they kind of hit a wall, and things slowed down a little bit, but not too much. You know, BYU still got up 28-7 after a 44-yard bomb from Jake Retzlaff to Darius Lassiter. I had forgot he had a deeper pass earlier in the season, Southern Illinois, to JoJo Phillips. But, man, this ball was impressive because he throws it from about BYU's 48-yard line, 49-yard line, and it's in the air the entire time till about the goal line. And then Lassiter comes up with the catch and goes in for the touchdown. It was an impressive showing. Lassiter was brilliant on Saturday. 8 catches, 120 yards. His first century mark game as a BYU Cougar. He was targeted 13 times. And I know that Jake Retzlaff kind of deflected on it and didn't speak much of it, but BYU had, it felt like by the untrained eye, at least by tendencies, I'll have to go watch the film again, but it looked like there were more empty sets, and BYU was just getting that ball off and getting the ball to the wide receivers because of the issues at running back. Now Nawahine was fine, 19 carries, 51 yards. It was fine, but still, that's 2.7 yards per carry. It was okay. Retzlaff was the best rusher once again, 6 carries, 53 yards, and a touchdown. But without L.J. Martin, without Sione Aimoa, who are your top 2 runners, there's not much to write home about on the ground from BYU's running backs right now. Pokai Honga had 7 carries, 21 yards, a little bit bigger workload, but still just not much pop there on the ground. And I know that Retzlaff kind of downplayed the notion of, a bigger focus on the game plan to get the ball to the receivers, but it just felt like there were more play calls in empty sets. They're going 5 wide, and they're just going quick hitters to receivers to get, 5, 6, 7, 8 yards, and even some chain movers with Lassiter and Chase Roberts. Chase Roberts had a relatively quiet game by his standards. 3 catches, 24 yards, 6 targets. He did have a drop. Lassiter did have 2 drops, too. He could have had 10 catches on the day, but he had a pair of drops for him. The receiving totals for BYU, Pokai Honga, 2 catches, 22 yards. Miles Davis, we noted him, the 26-yard grab, touchdown. Keelan Marion, 1 catch for 12 yards. Cody Epps, 1 catch, 6 yards. Didn't see him much, if at all, in the second half. Keanu Hill, 1 catch, 6 yards. And that was the workload from the receivers. BYU's defense showed well. They had struggles, though, passing defense, which we haven't discussed much this season. They had their fair share of issues there. And they give up 324 passing yards to Sawyer Robertson. And Baylor was in catch-up mode, and they were trying to come back from the big deficit. So it was an aerial attack. And, look, they had some breakthroughs. They got some athletes. You know, the Cameron, number 34, he's a breakout player for Baylor. Josh Cameron, he's really good. He's a junior. He's had a much improved season. He's going to be a really good player for the Baylor Bears going forward. But I thought it was noteworthy that, you know, BYU stopped the run. And I talked about it coming into the game. You know, Baylor had legit RB1 options. Just kind of a running back by committee deal, but they finished 28 carries, 63 yards, 1 touchdown running the football. Sawyer Robertson was honestly their most effective runner. 12 carries, 29 yards. They gave 3 carries to Dominic Richardson, and then Washington got 13 carries, but there was not much work on the ground from Baylor because of the hole that they were in. And so you got to give BYU credit on stopping the run the way that they did. You give up only 63 yards on the ground, I don't care how many yards you're going to get, you're going to win a lot of ball games that way. It kind of reminded me a little bit of 2019 USC, where, yeah, you gave up a lot of passing yards, but you completely made them one-dimensional. And at some point, you're going to break through and make a game-changing play to get that win. And in that case, in 2019, it was Dion Gunwolaku. Fast forward 5 years, it was on Saturday, Crew Wakley. Crew Wakley comes up with a massive interception, game clincher, and seals the deal for BYU. I will say, though, that possession that Baylor got, it was kind of a little bit frustrating that they got that possession, because I agree with Kalani. To use his term, quote, it was a bullcrap call. The unsportsmanlike penalty was just wrong. It was wrong. It was a total flop by the Baylor player, but the dramatics of the fall and how he sold it made it look by the ref like it was a legit push. And I'm looking at the scorebook, and Enoch Nawahine is believed to be the guy that was called for the unsportsmanlike, but the refs, the audio, he kind of got distracted and didn't say the number of the player. There was a case that it was either Nawahine or Caleb Etienne. Either way, it shouldn't have happened. I mean, Nawahine was kind of a little bit agitated, but what makes me kind of look at Etienne is where his arm goes up, and it's in the corner of the ref's eye, and then the player who's next to Etienne then falls. Either way, you know, Nawahine and Caleb Etienne, they shouldn't have any of that bodily reaction that makes it look even like they're, you know, making contact with an opposing player. But that 15-yard penalty, it gave Baylor a free timeout. It negated a nice first down run by Nawahine that put BYU in a 2nd-5, and they were looking to clock the game and just run down the clock. And then it suddenly puts them at 2nd-20, and that changes the entire dynamics of the entire game and how BYU is approaching that drive. You go into a 3rd and long where it's, you know, you're basically just run the football and don't turn it over. That was the thought, where you're not getting aggressive to be maybe in a 3rd and 3 and move the chains and ultimately finish the ball game. So that unsportsmanlike was poor. BYU finished the game, 4 penalties, 50 yards. So think about that. That unsportsmanlike was a quarter of BYU's penalty total. Another relatively pretty clean game for BYU in avoiding the handkerchiefs and the yellow flags. Honestly, I thought the officiating was okay. It wasn't that unsportsmanlike will be something that gets remembered and man, had BYU lost this game because it generated another possession for Baylor, it would have, lived in BYU lore as something that always gets remembered. But BYU moves on. Crew Wakley came up with a play, and the Cougs get the win. Crew Wakley, his story has been fascinating to monitor, and I kind of love his mindset, his demeanor about everything. He's a guy that's a little bit like the media, where he has his own podcast, and he's really, I think, public speaker-wise, I think he's one of the best interviews on the team. Crew Wakley has just been grinding, and it wasn't like he was asking for this opportunity at BYU. He didn't know football was going to be in the cards, and last year he joins onto the team at a transfer portal from Utah State, and he might not even be playing football anymore. He might have moved on, and next thing you know, he's one of the studs for BYU. And even this season, it felt like a case of, okay, Micah Harper's coming back. You've got Falatau Satuala. You've got Tommy Parasis. This might be a deal where someone like a Crew Wakley just kind of gets, pushed to the side, and the top dogs from yesteryear and new wave of players step to the forefront. But Wakley's just been grinding, and he's now emerged as a starter, and you don't budge from that. He's one of the top players on the back end of the defense. He's playing at a higher level right now than Micah Harper. Him and Tanner Wall are the two best safeties on this team right now. And no one would have picked that combo a month ago. Not me, not anyone. And Crew Wakley is balling, and he deserves it. It's not just smoke and mirrors. It's not just this one play, right spot, right moment. No, he's playing legit. And look, he played well last year, but it was a case of he got elevated because of, injuries from players, and it just felt like once those injured players came back, he was going to be kind of out of sight and out of mind. But, he showed well last season, but now he has a better understanding of this defense, like everyone on this team, and he's playing at a really high level. I was really impressed with Crew Wakley, and, of course, hard not to when he comes up with a game-clinching interception. He finished with 4 tackles. He also had a sack, too. I love that pressure Jay Hill dialed up for Crew Wakley. He comes in, took his time. He was kind of patient, did a spin move, gets to the QB, though, and that closing speed to get home and finish the job. Impressive day by Crew Wakley. And how about, again, the BYU defense? 3 sacks in this game. 3 sacks, folks. Don't take that for granted. I mean, that game alone would have been a third of BYU's sack total a season ago, or a fourth almost, 3.5. BYU has just made significant strides. But going forward, you wonder how things are going to look for this BYU team, because they got banged up in that game against Baylor. Connor Pay, he got carted off, came back to the field on crutches and was in street clothes. Harrison Taggart, he mysteriously was missing during the first half, and then I identified him on the sideline, no helmet near him. I don't want to speculate on what the injury could be, but typically there's kind of tendencies with that when the helmet's not around. But Harrison Taggart got banged up. Waylon Lapuaho got banged up. He did come back, but still got banged up. Isaiah Glasker got banged up. I mean, this was a tough game, and it was interesting that Kalani did point out that the playing surface was hard on the players' bodies. And they dug into their depth, man. And they didn't have Evan Johnson. He was banged up from last week's injury, shoulder injury that he suffered. We saw some Jaden Dunlap. We saw some interesting personnel combos. But the great thing is that you're 5-0, and a lot of these guys have played, and they've played meaningful snaps. Someone that I thought was kind of an underrated performer in this game was Isaiah Moa, number 58, former 4-star recruit, defensive end prospect. He switched over to linebacker. He's lost some weight. Isaiah Moa had a nice game. There were some mistakes probably, and he'll have to go back to the film, but for a guy that hasn't played much in his BYU career, he gets thrown into the fire, And in stretches when he got thrown in at first, BYU was up big. So it wasn't a pressure cooker situation. But over the course of the game, it became a pressure cooker, and you had to perform. And he did. He finished up with 2 tackles. But I like that you're seeing signs from that depth. I'm big on that because you don't want to just be a one-hit wonder. You don't want to just be the 1 year, okay, like so many in the Big 12 where, senior-laden team, you had a special year, so many close calls, you found a way to get wins. Okay, great, but then the next year you just fall off a cliff. Still a lot of football to be played this season, but you're getting contributions from Ice Moa. You're getting contributions from John Taumaipeau, who had that sack that forced the roughing or the intentional grounding from Sawyer Robertson. Jonathan Kabea, he was playing late in the game on the critical 4th down defensive drives. Jonathan Kabea was in the game. And, I can just go on and on. Viliami Puha, he had a tackle, a nice play. Sialia Serra got snaps. Bruce Mitchell played, of course, on the offensive line when that thing got reshuffled. And that was underrated, too, because he goes to left guard for Waylon. Waylon comes back, and instead of, Bruce going to the bench, he then takes over for Lea Usa, who took over for Makasini, and Makasini took over for Connor Pay. Kind of interesting movement there. It's going to be kind of interesting to see how the offensive line shakes out for Arizona week, because coming out of this one, it feels like it might need to be not a reset because the tackle positions are stout, but that interior, maybe you need to have a little bit of competition and see how things go. But I thought Makasini did a solid job at center, and I thought Bruce Mitchell continues to be one of the pleasant surprises this season. But so many underrated guys making contributions and contributing to this team. It's a promising sign, because as these young personnel and players continue to develop and get game reps, and then you pair it up with some of these new recruits that are coming to BYU, they have long list of P4 offers, guys that have been heavily recruited. Not all, but BYU's got commits in the 2025 class that were wanted by other schools. You just start to have a more competitive Power 4 roster that week after week you can withstand the injuries because you've got the competition, you've got the personnel, you've got the depth, and you're seeing the signs of that this season. Think about how much BYU has improved as a program. Look, they had some ups and downs in 2022 and 2023. 3 years ago, BYU was here in Waco. And after they lost that game by 2 touchdowns, and really it wasn't that close, Baylor just handled BYU. And that was a great Baylor team. 12-2, won the Sugar Bowl, won the Big 12. But 3 years ago, Kalani was just getting peppered with questions of, what does this say about the gap between you and the Big 12? And the gap, and how you got to compete in this league, and what you got to do to get things fixed. That was 3 years ago. It feels like a lifetime in many respects, but think about how much progress they've made in 3 years. And you could say that how much progress has there been? They're only 5-0. Last year was a losing season. 2 years ago was 8-5. But you've quietly seen this roster get built up to where there's so much more depth, so much quality personnel that, yes, it's a bummer when someone goes down, but the weight of a team is not on the shoulders of one guy anymore. And I just think that's a positive development for BYU football that they have not had often, ever. I mean, you lose one guy, and look, you want to have those superstar generational guys that if you lose them, oh my gosh, like it feels like the end of the world because you just love seeing those guys play. But it's a nice feeling to know that you can go to your 5th string running back and he can still get you something. You can go to your 3rd string nickel and he's still playing at a pretty high clip. That's what's been on display for BYU in stretches this season. And I think you see the 5-0 and you think, oh, it's just all perfect. Like, no, BYU by no means is perfect. They're perfect in the record, and that's all that matters. But as far as the on-field execution, the Baylor opening minutes, that 21-zip stretch was darn near perfect. The closing, middle 8 against Kansas State was darn near perfect. But there are so many things where they can still get better. And I just think that gets you excited about the prospects of what BYU can become. And when you kind of take a step back and just think, they've grown a lot in 3 years. From when they last visited McLean Stadium in Baylor to now, they've grown a lot, whereas Baylor has completely regressed. And I still think Baylor's got some legit individual talent. I just don't think they've got great chemistry, and that culture that Kalani talks about with his program, that's not on display right now with Baylor. That seems like a team that's ready to just fold up shop and move on. Like, they had no heart and fight in the opening minutes. They bounced back in the second half and gave some good fight, but I just kind of question what's Baylor going to become. It feels like the end is near for Dave Aranda, but we'll see. BYU, though, they're playing some great football right now, and they got better days potentially ahead. I think what's exciting now, you've got a bye week, so you can rest up, get healed up, and it's much needed for this team. And then you got 2 home games. Arizona, Oklahoma State. Look, Oklahoma State's playing out the way I thought they probably would. They're underperforming. They are not as good as what we thought they were a season ago. I think because of their appearance in the Big 12 championship game, people kind of anointed them and said, oh, they're the real deal. But they had a weak schedule last year, and their recruiting is kind of taking a step back. They're not playing great. BYU can win that game. Arizona's going to be tough. That's that quarterback, Noah Fafita and T-Mac. That will be one of the toughest challenges from a skill position personnel that BYU has faced, Avery Johnson included. But, man, BYU's got a real chance here to make some serious noise nationally and be in the hunt for the Big 12 championship game. Like, winning that game on Saturday against Baylor puts them firmly in that conversation, because you're 2-0, you've got to win over one of the better teams, and you've got now 2 games coming up at home. You get to 4-0 maybe, and look, a lot of football left, but we're in the media. We can look ahead of stuff. This team could have some damage, make some damage, and you don't need to be perfect to get to the Big 12 championship game. You could be maybe, at worst, a 3-loss team and get to that thing. We're seeing teams getting beat up all across the field in the Big 12, like up and down performances each and every week. But, even 2 losses, you probably get in. So they put themselves in a spot where they've got a little bit of margin for error, but they keep stacking up these wins. So much is in front of them this season. But that's going to do it for this edition of the Cougar Tracks podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Cougs get the win, 34-28. Listen to me and Matt Baiamonte Monday night. We'll be taking your phone calls on Cougar Nation, 801-575-8255. Call in 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. We'll be taking your phone calls and getting your reaction to this Baylor win and looking ahead to what's next for BYU football. So talk to you then here on the Cougar Tracks podcast, and it's powered by KSLSports.com.